6. Life processes. How do we tell the difference between what is alive and what is not alive? If we see a dog running, or a cow chewing cud, or a man shouting loudly on the street, we know that these are living beings. What if the dog, or the cow, or the man were asleep? We would still think that they are alive, but how did we know that? We see them breathing, and we know that they are alive. What about plants? How do we know about them that they are alive? We see them green. Some of us will say, but what about the plants that have leaves of colors other than green? They grow over time, so we know that they are alive, some will say. In other words, we tend to think of some sort of movement, either growth related or not, as common evidence for being alive. But a plant that is not visibly growing is still alive, and some animals can breathe without visible movement. So, using visible movement as the defining characteristic of life is not enough. Movements over very small scales will be visible to the naked eye. Movements of molecules, for example, is this invisible molecular movement necessary for life? If we ask this question to professional biologists, they will say yes. In fact, viruses do not show any molecular movement in them until they infect some cell, and that is partly why there is a controversy about whether they are truly alive or not. Why are molecular movements needed for life? We have seen in earlier classes that living organisms are well organized structures. They can have tissues. Tissues have cells. Cells have smaller components in them, and so on. Because of the effects of the environment, this organized, ordered nature of living structures is very likely to keep breaking down over time. If order breaks down, the organism will no longer be alive. So, living creatures must keep repairing and maintaining their structures. Since all these structures are made up of molecules, they must move molecules around all the time. What are the maintenance processes in living organisms? Let us explore. What are life processes? The maintenance functions of living organisms must go on even when they are not doing anything particular. Even when we are just sitting in class, even if we are just asleep, this maintenance job has to go on. The processes which together perform this maintenance job are life processes. Since these maintenance processes are needed to prevent damage and breakdown, energy is needed for them. This energy comes from outside the body of the individual organism. So, there must be a process to transfer a source of energy from outside the body of the organism, which we call food, to the inside, a process we commonly call nutrition. If the body size of the organism is to grow, additional raw material will also be needed from outside. Since life on Earth depends on carbon based molecules, most of these food sources are also carbon based. Depending on the complexity of these carbon sources, different organisms can then use different kinds of nutritional processes. The outside sources of energy could be quite varied since the environment is not under the control of the individual organism. These sources of energy, therefore, need to be broken down or built up in the body and must be finally converted to a uniform source of energy that can be used for the various molecular movements needed for maintaining living structures as well as to the kind of molecules the body needs to grow. For this, a series of chemical reactions in the body are necessary. Oxidizing, reducing reactions are some of the most common chemical means to break down molecules. For this, many organisms use oxygen sourced from outside the body. The process of acquiring oxygen from outside the body and to use it in the process of breakdown of food sources for cellular needs is what we call respiration. In the case of single-celled organism, no specific organs for taking in food, exchange of gases or removal of waste may be needed because the entire surface of the organism is in contact with the environment. But what happens when the size of the organism increases and the body design becomes more complex. In multicellular organisms, all the cells may not be in direct contact with the surrounding environment. Thus, simple diffusion will not meet the requirements of the cells. We have seen previously how in multicellular organisms various body parts have specialized in the functions they perform. We are familiar with the idea of these specialized tissues and with their organization in the body of the organism. It is therefore not surprising that the uptake of food and of oxygen will also be the function of specialized tissues. However, this poses a problem. Since the food and the oxygen are now taken up at one place in the body of the organisms while all parts of the body need them. This situation creates a need for a transportation system for carrying food and oxygen from one place to another in a body. When chemical reactions use the carbon source and the oxygen for energy generation, they create byproducts that are not only useless for the cells of the body but could even be harmful. These waste byproducts are therefore needed to be removed from the body and discarded outside by the process called excretion. Again, if the basic rules for body design in multicellular organisms are followed, a specialized tissue for excretion will be developed, which means that the transportation system will need to transport waste away from cells to this excretory tissue. Let us consider these various processes so essential to maintain life one by one. Nutrition. When we walk or ride a bicycle, we are using up energy. Even when we are not doing any apparent activity, energy is needed to maintain a state of order in our body. We also need materials from outside in order to grow, develop, synthesize protein and other substances needed in the body. This source of energy and materials is the food we eat. How do living things get their food? The general requirement for energy and material is common in all organisms, but it is fulfilled in different ways. Some organisms use simple food material obtained from inorganic sources in the form of carbon dioxide and water. These organisms, the autotrophs, include green plants and some bacteria. Other organisms utilize complex substances. These complex substances have to be broken down into simpler ones before they can be used for the upkeep and growth of the body. To achieve this, organisms use biocatalysts called enzymes. Thus, the heterotroph's survival depends directly or indirectly on autotrophs. Heterotrophic organisms include animals and fungi. Autotrophic nutrition. Carbon and energy requirement of autotrophic organisms are fulfilled by photosynthesis. It is the process by which autotrophs take in substances from the outside and convert them into stored forms of energy. This material is taken in the form of carbon dioxide and water, which is converted into carbohydrates in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll. Carbohydrates are utilized for providing energy to the plant. We will study how this takes place in the next section. The carbohydrates which are not used immediately are stored in the form of starch, which serves as internal energy reserve to be used as and when required by the plants. A somewhat similar situation is seen in us, where some of the energy derived from the food we eat is stored in our body in the form of glycogen. 6 CO2 plus 12 H2O in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll gives rise to C6H12O6 plus 6O2 plus 6H2O. Let us see what exactly happens during the process of photosynthesis. The following events occur during this process. First, absorption of light energy by chlorophyll. Second, conversion of light energy to chemical energy and splitting of water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. Third, reduction of carbon dioxide to carbohydrates. These steps need not to take place one after the other immediately. For example, desert plants take up carbon dioxide at night and prepare an intermediate which is acted upon by the energy absorbed by the chlorophyll during the day. Let us see how each of the components of the above reaction are necessary for photosynthesis. If you carefully observe a cross section of a leaf under microscope, as shown in figure 6.1, you will notice that some cells contain green dots. These green dots are cell organelles called chloroplast, which contain chlorophyll. Let us do an activity which demonstrates that chlorophyll is essential for photosynthesis. Activity 6.1. Take a potted plant with variegated leaves, for example, money plant or croutons. Keep the plant in a dark room for 3 days so that all the starch gets used up. Now keep the plant in sunlight for about 6 hours. Pluck a leaf from the plant, mark the green areas in it and trace them on a sheet of paper. Dip the leaf in boiling water for a few minutes. After this, immerse it in a beaker containing alcohol. Carefully place the above beaker in a water bath and heat till the alcohol begins to boil. What happens to the color of the leaf? What is the color of the solution? Now dip the leaf in dilute solution of iodine for a few minutes. Take out the leaf and rinse off the iodine solution. Observe the color of the leaf and compare this with the tracing of the leaf done in the beginning. What can you conclude about the presence of starch in various areas of a leaf? Now let us study how the plant obtains carbon dioxide. In class 9th, we have talked about stomata, as shown in figure 6.3, which are tiny pores present on the surface of the leaves. Massive amounts of gaseous exchange takes place in the leaves through these pores for the purpose of photosynthesis. But it is important to note here that exchange of gases occurs across the surface of stems, roots and leaves as well. Since large amounts of water can also be lost through these stomata, the plant closes these pores when it does not need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. The opening and closing of the pore is a function of the guard cells. The guard cells swell when water flows into them, causing the stomatal pore to open. Similarly, the pore closes if the guard cells shrink. Activity 6.2. Take 2 healthy potted plants which are nearly the same size. Keep them in a dark room for 3 days. Now place each plant on separate glass plates. Place a watch glass containing potassium hydroxide by the side of one of the plants. The potassium hydroxide is used to absorb carbon dioxide. Cover both plants with separate bell jars as shown in figure 6.4. Use Vaseline to seal the bottom of the jars to the glass plates so that the setup is airtight. Keep the plants in sunlight for about 2 hours. Pluck a leaf from each plant and check for the presence of starch as in the above activity. Do both the leaves show the presence of same amount of starch? What can you conclude from this activity? Based on the 2 activities performed above, can we design an experiment to demonstrate that sunlight is essential for photosynthesis? So far, we have talked about how autotrophs meet their energy requirements, but they also need other raw materials for building their body. Water used in photosynthesis is taken up from the soil by the roots in terrestrial plants. Other plant materials like nitrogen, phosphorus, iron and magnesium are taken up from the soil. Nitrogen is an essential element used in the synthesis of proteins and other compounds. This is taken up in the form of inorganic nitrates or nitrites, or it is taken up as organic compounds which have been prepared by bacteria from atmospheric nitrogen. Heterotrophic nutrition. Each organism is adapted to its environment. The form of nutrition differs depending on the type and availability of food material as well as how it is obtained by the organism. For example, whether the food source is stationary such as grass or mobile such as a deer would allow for differences in how the food is assessed and what is the nutritive apparatus used by a cow and a lion. There is a range of strategies by which the food is taken in and used by the organism. Some organisms break down the food material outside the body and then absorb it. Examples are fungi like bread molds, yeast, and mushrooms. Others take in whole material and break it down inside their bodies. What can be taken in and broken down depends on the body design and functioning. Some other organisms derive nutrition from plants or animals without killing them. This parasitic nutritive strategy is used by a wide variety of organisms like cuscuta, amarbale, ticks, lice, leeches, and tapeworms. How do organisms obtain their nutrition? Since the food and the way it is obtained differ, the digestive system is different in various organisms. In single celled organisms, the food may be taken in by the entire surface, but as the complexity of the organism increases, different parts become specialized to perform different functions. For example, amoeba takes in food using temporary finger like extensions of the cell surface which fuse over the food particle, forming a food vacuole. Inside the food vacuole, complex substances are broken down into simpler ones, which then diffuse into the cytoplasm. The remaining undigested material is moved to the surface of the cell and thrown out. In Paramecium, which is also a unicellular organism, the cell has a definite shape and food is taken in it at a specific spot. Food is moved to this spot by the movement of cilia, which cover the entire surface of the cell. Nutrition in human beings. The alimentary canal is basically a long tube extended from the mouth to the anus. In figure 6.6, we can see that the tube has different parts. Various regions are specialized to perform different functions. What happens to the food once it enters our body? We shall discuss this process here. Activity 6.3. Take 1 ml starch solution 1% in two test tubes A and B. Add 1 ml saliva to test tube A and leave both test tubes undisturbed for 20 to 30 minutes. Now add a few drops of dilute iodine solution to the test tubes. In which test tube do you observe a color change? What does this indicate about the presence or absence of starch in the two test tubes? What does this tell us about the action of saliva on starch? We eat various types of foods which has to pass through the same digestive tract. Naturally, the food has to be processed to generate particles which are small and of the same texture. This is achieved by crushing the food with our teeth. Since the lining of the canal is soft, the food is also wetted to make its passage smooth. When we eat something we like, our mouth waters. This is actually not only water but a fluid called saliva secreted by the salivary glands. Another aspect of the food we ingest is its complex nature. If it is to be absorbed from the alimentary canal, it has to be broken into smaller molecules. This is done with the help of biological catalysts called enzymes. The saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase that breaks down starch, which is a complex molecule, to give simple sugar. The food is mixed thoroughly with saliva and moved around the mouth while chewing by muscular tongue. It is necessary to move the food in a regulated manner along the digestive tube so that it can be processed properly in each part. The lining of canal has muscles that contract rhythmically in order to push the food forward. These peristaltic movements occur all along the gut. From the mouth, the food is taken to the stomach through the food pipe or oesophagus. The stomach is a large organ which expands when food enters it. The muscular walls of the stomach help in mixing the food thoroughly with more digestive juices. The digestion in the stomach is taken care of by the gastric glands present in the wall of the stomach. These release hydrochloric acid, a protein digesting enzyme called pepsin, and mucus. The hydrochloric acid creates an acidic medium which facilitates the action of enzyme pepsin. What other functions do you think is served by the acid? The mucus protects the inner lining of the stomach from the action of the acid under normal conditions. We have often heard adults complaining about acidity. Can this be related to what has been discussed above? The exit of food from the stomach is regulated by a sphincter muscle which releases it in small amounts into the small intestine. From the stomach, the food now enters the small intestine. This is the longest part of the alimentary canal, which is fitted into a compact space because of extensive coiling. The length of small intestine differs in various animals depending on the food they eat. Herbivores eating grass need a longer intestine to allow the cellulose to be digested. Meat is easier to digest, hence, carnivores like tigers have a shorter small intestine. The small intestine is the site of the complete digestion of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. It receives the secretions of the liver and pancreas for this purpose. The food coming from the stomach is acidic and has to be made alkaline for the pancreatic enzymes to act. Bile juice from the liver accomplishes this in addition to acting on fats. Fats are present in the intestine in the form of large globules, which makes it difficult for enzymes to act on them. Bile salts break them down into smaller globules, increasing the efficiency of enzyme action. This is similar to the emulsifying action of soaps on dirt, which we have learnt about in chapter 4. The pancreas secretes pancreatic juice, which contains enzymes like trypsin for digesting proteins and lipase for breaking down emulsified fats. The walls of the small intestine contain glands which secrete intestinal juice. The enzymes present in it finally convert the proteins to amino acids, complex carbohydrates into glucose, and fats into fatty acids and glycerol. Digested food is taken up by the walls of the intestine. The inner lining of small intestine has numerous finger-like projections called villi, which increases the surface area of absorption. The villi are richly supplied with blood vessels which take the absorbed food to each and every cell of the body, where it is utilized for obtaining energy, building up new tissues, and the repair of old tissues. The unabsorbed food is sent into the large intestine, where its wall absorb more water from this material. The rest of the material is removed from the body via the anus. The exit of this waste material is regulated by anal sphincter. Dental caries or tooth decay causes gradual softening of enamel and dentine. It begins when bacteria acting on sugars produce acids that softens or demineralizes the enamel. Masses of bacterial cells together with food particles stick to the teeth to form dental plaque. Saliva cannot reach the tooth surface to neutralize the acid as plaque covers the teeth. Brushing the teeth after eating removes the plaque before the bacteria produces acids. If untreated, microorganisms may invade the pulp, causing inflammation and infection. Respiration. Activity 6.4. Take some freshly prepared lime water in a test tube. Blow air through this lime water. Note how long it takes for the lime water to turn milky. Use a syringe or pichkari to pass air through some fresh lime water taken in another test tube, figure 6.7. Note how long it takes for this lime water to turn milky. What does this tell us about the amount of carbon dioxide in the air that we breathe out? Activity 6.5. Take some fruit juice or sugar solution and add some yeast to this. Take this mixture in a test tube fitted with one hole cork. Fit the cork with a bent glass tube. Dip the free end of the glass tube into a test tube containing freshly prepared lime water. What change is observed in lime water and how long does it take for this change to occur? What does this tell us about the products of fermentation? We have discussed nutrition in organisms in last section. The food material taken in during the process of nutrition is used in cells to provide energy for various life processes. Diverse organisms do this in different ways. Some use oxygen to break down glucose completely into carbon dioxide and water. Some use other pathways that do not involve oxygen. In all cases, the first step is the breakdown of glucose, a 6 carbon molecule, into a 3 carbon molecule called pyruvate. This process takes place in the cytoplasm. Further, pyruvate may be converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide. This process takes place in yeast during fermentation. Since this process takes place in the absence of air or oxygen, it is called anaerobic respiration. Breaking down of pyruvate using oxygen takes place in the mitochondria, and this process breaks up 3 carbon pyruvate molecule to give 3 molecule of carbon dioxide. The other product is water. Since this process takes place in the presence of air, it is called aerobic respiration. The release of energy in this aerobic process is a lot greater than in anaerobic process. Sometimes when there is a lack of oxygen in our muscle cells, another pathway for the breakdown of pyruvate is taken. Here pyruvate is converted into lactic acid, which is also a 3 carbon molecule. This buildup of lactic acid in our muscles during sudden activity causes cramps. Figure 6.8, breakdown of glucose by various pathways. Glucose, 6 carbon molecule in cytoplasm, gets converted into pyruvate, 3 carbon molecule plus energy. 3 things can happen. First, absence of oxygen in yeast, ethanol plus carbon dioxide plus energy is formed. Lack of oxygen in our muscle cells, lactic acid, 3 carbon molecule plus energy is formed. Third, presence of oxygen in mitochondria, carbon dioxide plus water plus energy is released. The energy released during cellular respiration is immediately used to synthesize a molecule called ATP, which is used to fuel all other activities in the cell. In these processes, ATP is broken down, giving rise to a fixed amount of energy which can drive the endothermic reaction taking place in the cell. ATP is the energy currency for most cellular processes. The energy released during the process of respiration is used to make an ATP molecule from ADP and inorganic phosphate. ADP plus P in presence of energy gives rise to ATP, where P stands for phosphate. Endothermic processes in cell then use this ATP to drive the reactions. When the terminal phosphate linkages in ATP is broken using water, the energy equivalent to 30.5 kJ per mole is released. Think of how a battery can provide energy for many different kinds of uses. It can be used to obtain mechanical energy, light energy, electrical energy, and so on. Similarly, ATP can be used in cells for the contraction of muscles, protein synthesis, conduction of nervous impulses, and many other activities. Since the aerobic respiration pathway depends on oxygen, aerobic organisms need to ensure that there is sufficient intake of oxygen. We have seen that plants exchange gases through stomata, and the large intercellular spaces ensure that all cells are in contact with air. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged by diffusion here. They can go into cells or away from them and out into the air. The direction of diffusion depends upon the environmental conditions and the requirements of the plant. At night, when there is no photosynthesis occurring, CO2 elimination is the major exchange activity going on. During the day, CO2 generated during respiration is used up for photosynthesis. Hence, there is no CO2 release. Instead, oxygen release is the major event at this time. Animals have evolved different organs for the uptake of oxygen from the environment and for getting rid of the carbon dioxide produced. Terrestrial animals can breathe the oxygen in the atmosphere, but animals that live in water need to use oxygen dissolved in water. Activity 6.6. Observe fish in an aquarium. They open and close their mouth, and the gill slits or the operculum, which covers the gill slits behind their eyes, also open and close. Are the timings of the opening and closing of the mouth and gill slits coordinated in same manner? In some manner, count the number of times the fish opens and closes its mouth in a minute. Compare this to the number of times you breathe in and out in a minute. Since the amount of dissolved oxygen is fairly low compared to the amount of oxygen in the air, the rate of breathing in aquatic organisms is much faster than that seen in the terrestrial organisms. Fishes take in water through their mouths and force it past the gills, where the dissolved oxygen is taken up by blood. Terrestrial organisms use the oxygen in atmosphere for respiration. This oxygen is absorbed by different organs in different animals. All these organs have a structure that increases the surface area which is in contact with oxygen rich atmosphere. Since the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide has to take place across the surface, this surface is very fine and delicate. In order to protect this surface, it is usually placed within the body, so there have to be passages that will take air to this area. In addition, there is a mechanism for moving the air in and out of this area where the oxygen is absorbed. In human beings, as shown in figure 6.9, air is taken into the body through the nostrils. The air passing through the nostrils is filtered by the fine hairs that line the passage. The passage is also lined with mucus, which helps in this process. From here, the air passes through the throat and into the lungs. Rings of cartilages are present in the throat. These ensure that air passage does not collapse. More to know, using tobacco directly or any product of tobacco in the form of cigars, cigarettes, bidis, hookahs, gutkhas, etc. is harmful. Use of tobacco most commonly affects tongue, lungs, heart and liver. Smokeless tobacco is also a major risk factor for heart attacks, strokes, pulmonary diseases and several forms of cancer. There is a high incidence of oral cancer in India due to the chewing of tobacco in the form of gutkha. Stay healthy and just say no to tobacco and its products. Within the lungs, the passage divides into smaller and smaller tubes which finally terminate in balloon-like structure which are called alveoli, singular alveolus. The alveoli provide a surface where the exchange of gases can take place. The walls of the alveoli contain an extensive network of blood vessels. As we have seen in earlier years, when we breathe in, we lift our ribs and flatten our diaphragm, and the chest cavity becomes larger as a result. Because of this, air is sucked into the lungs and fills the expanded alveoli. The blood brings carbon dioxide from the rest of the body for release into the alveoli, and the oxygen in the alveolar air is taken up by blood in alveolar blood vessels to be transported to all the cells in the body. During the breathing cycle, when air is taken in and let out, the lungs always contain a residual volume of air so that there is sufficient time for oxygen to be absorbed and for the carbon dioxide to be released. When the body size of animals is large, the diffusion pressure alone cannot take care of oxygen delivery to all parts of the body. Instead, respiratory pigments take up oxygen from the air in the lungs and carry it to the tissues which are deficient in oxygen before releasing it. In human beings, the respiratory pigment is hemoglobin, which has a very high affinity for oxygen. This pigment is present in red blood corpuscles. Carbon dioxide is more soluble in water than oxygen is, and hence mostly transported in the dissolved form in our blood. Smoking is injurious to health. Lung cancer is one of the common causes of the deaths in the world. The upper part of respiratory tract is provided with small hair-like structures called cilia. These cilia help to remove germs, dust, and other harmful particles from inhaled air. Smoking destroys these hair, due to which germs, dust, smoke, other harmful chemicals enter into lungs and cause infection and cough and even lung cancer. If the alveolar surface was spread out, it would cover about 80 meters square. How much do you think the surface area of your body is? Consider how efficient exchange of gases becomes because of the large surface area available for the exchange to take place. If diffusion were to move oxygen in our body, it is estimated that it would take 3 years for a molecule of oxygen to get to our toes from our lungs. Aren't you glad that we have hemoglobin? Transportation. Transportation in human beings, which we will do in the next part of the video. Thank you for listening.